and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes. And that was because they were angry with Camilla.
Whispers curled through royal corridors long before the world ever heard a word. But nothing prepared anyone for the moment. King Charles finally broke his silence and uttered the chilling phrase, "I hated her." Those 3 words, sharp as shattered glass, immediately ignited a storm across Britain and beyond. Advisors froze. Family members reportedly exchanged stunned glances, and the public? They were left scrambling to understand who he meant, and why now. So, what buried story, long concealed beneath decades of royal secrecy, pushed the king to finally reveal such explosive truth? A voice that shattered the quiet. The words slipped into the air with a weight no one expected, heavy enough to still the breath of those who heard them. In a room where restraint had always been the unspoken rule, where every gesture of the monarch was measured and guarded, the trembling voice of King Charles III broke through the stillness. It was not the polished tone the public had come to recognize from countless speeches and ceremonial appearances. This was something raw, an unfiltered crack in the armor of a man who had been trained for silence more than sincerity. And from that fractured moment came a sentence that would ripple far beyond palace walls. He said he had hated her. It was a confession that did not arrive with fanfare or the dramatic flourish of a public address. It emerged quietly, almost reluctantly, like truth escaping from years of carefully constructed control. But once spoken, there was no pulling it back. The impact of those words lingered, drawing the mind toward the question that now demanded an answer. Why would a king choose to reveal such a private, unsettling emotion after decades of careful composure? Why now, after a lifetime spent shielding personal feelings behind royal duty and tradition? For much of his life, Charles had been trapped between who he was expected to be and who he truly was. From the pressures of his youth to the public scrutiny that followed him into adulthood, every step appeared orchestrated by expectations he never fully owned. His long-standing connection with Camilla had shadowed his journey through the monarchy, surviving years of separation, judgment, and whispered criticism. That bond, persistent and complicated, became one of the most publicly dissected relationships in modern royal history. It placed him at the center of a narrative he never asked for, one where personal choices were questioned, interpreted, and judged by millions. Over time, the constant surveillance created an invisible cage around him. Every smile, gesture, or glance became a clue for someone to analyze. Every moment of hesitation could trigger rumors. The private world he longed for shrank until it was almost non-existent. What remained was a life lived under the same spotlight that once forced him to hide his real emotions and protect relationships too fragile to withstand the glare. So when he uttered the words, "I hated her," they did not simply point toward a single person. They pointed toward an entire life shaped by relentless intrusion. It was not hatred born from sudden anger, but from years of pressure building beneath a calm surface. Pressure that transformed personal longing into quiet resentment. He resented the unseen presence that had followed him for years, the presence that stole choices from him and exposed the parts of his life that were meant to stay hidden. That resentment had a shape, a shadow, and a history. And though he never named it in that moment, its influence had marked nearly every chapter of his story. And yet, even with those words spoken, the deeper layers of his admission were only beginning to unfold. But what do you think shaped his silent resentment and the unseen shadow that quietly haunted every choice he made? Stay tuned. The moment his heart finally broke. The confession he had whispered earlier did not drift away. It hovered over him like a shadow that refused to fade. Anyone listening closely could sense that those words came from a place far deeper than passing anger. They came from wounds that had been carved long before the world realized he was hurting. And as his voice settled into silence, the next part of his truth began to take shape, revealing not just resentment, but a sorrow that had lived quietly within him for years. For Charles, heartbreak did not arrive in a single dramatic instant. It gathered slowly, piece by piece, until the weight of it became impossible to keep hidden. It began in the moments when he realized his personal life had stopped belonging to him. Every choice, every whisper of emotion, every sign of affection or lack of it became material for public debate. People discussed him as if he were a character in a story rather than a man navigating feelings he barely had room to understand. The world often saw his position as privilege, but rarely did it notice the sacrifices that came with it. And among those sacrifices was the painful truth that even the most private matters could be twisted into spectacle. He had always been a man who loved quietly, who valued loyalty and long-standing bonds. But the life he stepped into demanded that those bonds be reshaped, repurposed, or hidden away entirely. What should have been personal became material for headlines, documentaries, and whispered judgment. It was this constant intrusion that chipped away at him. One moment after another stripped him of the freedom to feel without fear. His heart carried memories of a connection that had survived time, separation, and expectation. Yet every time that connection resurfaced, it felt like the entire world was standing too close, watching, picking apart details that were never theirs to claim. And when certain calls were leaked, intimate conversations that should have remained safe, the humiliation cut deeper than he ever admitted openly. It was not just embarrassment, it was betrayal. The privacy that every human being deserved had been stolen from him, displayed for strangers to dissect. And in the middle of all this, the person beside him was placed under equal, if not greater, scrutiny. Diana's pain became public property, her suffering captured in headlines that stretched around the globe. Every tear, every confession, every sign of unhappiness became footage the world consumed. He saw how the intensity of that exposure placed cracks in everything around them, cracks that eventually grew too wide to mend. His own sorrow blended with hers, until both found themselves drowning in a story neither had full control over. This was the heartbreak that shaped his confession. When he finally said the words, "I hated her," the hatred was not directed at a single person, but at the force that destroyed the chance for love to exist peacefully in his life. He hated the spotlight that magnified every misstep. He hated the voices that fed on his failures. He hated the public fracture that made genuine affection feel dangerous. And most of all, he hated the way humiliation had become tied to his heart, leaving him to navigate grief under the gaze of millions. Yet even as he confronted those emotions, he knew that this was only one layer of the story, because the sorrow he carried had roots that stretched even further into the past. So how did the weight of past loves and public scrutiny push him to confess a hatred that was never simple? Keep watching. The weight of two lives that never fit. The heartbreak that followed him like a silent companion did not begin with a single event. It grew from years of being shaped into someone the world expected, while his inner desires were pushed aside. And now, as he confronted memories long buried under duty, the pain pulled him toward another truth he had spent a lifetime avoiding. His sorrow was no longer just about public humiliation or the invasion of his private world. It was about the deep, unspoken ache of being bound to a life that never matched the one he wanted. And at the center of that ache was a woman who had always been there, even when she wasn't physically beside him. Camilla. She had existed in his story long before the world attached scandal to her name. Their bond had formed quietly, naturally, in a time when he could still act on emotion without the crushing weight of headlines. But the moment his path became tied to the crown, everything changed. His heart might have known Camilla, but the institution demanded someone entirely different, a bride who fit the image, the tradition, the spotless narrative expected of a future king. It didn't ask what he felt. It didn't care what he longed for. It only cared that he followed the script. This mismatch between heart and duty, between desire and expectation, became a wound that never healed. Diana, unforgettable for her youth, innocence, and raw vulnerability, was barely stepping out of adolescence when her life was placed under a spotlight brighter than anything she could have prepared for. The 12-year gap between them was not simply age, it was a divide in experience, in emotional readiness, in understanding the suffocating demands of royal life. She was thrust into a world built on centuries of rigid rules, while he was expected to mold himself into the perfect partner for a woman chosen not because she matched him, but because she matched what the monarchy wanted. And yet, through it all, Camilla's presence lingered, not through scandal, but through history. She was the reminder of what he could never fully have, and the symbol of a life he believed was taken from him. The more he tried to adapt to the role forced upon him, the greater the distance he felt between who he was allowed to love and who he actually loved. That distance, stretched across years of pretending and performing, eventually hardened into bitterness. So when he admitted he had hated her, the meaning began to shift into something sharper, more painful. He hated the mismatch that defined his life. He hated how the crown demanded harmony where none existed. And beneath all of that, he hated the impossible position he had been placed in, forced to stand beside someone who deserved genuine love and protection, while his own heart remained tied to someone he could not freely choose. His sorrow was not simple jealousy or regret. It was the crushing realization that his life had been shaped by forces larger than himself. And as he remembered the woman who had remained in his heart despite every attempt to suppress the truth, the emotions rising within him were no longer just sorrow. They were the beginnings of a confession he had avoided for decades, one that edged him closer to the next painful revelation. How did a lifetime of hidden sorrow and forbidden memories push him toward a confession no one expected? Stay glued. When private shadows became public wounds. The sorrow that had been growing inside him did not settle. It kept rising, pushing old memories back to the surface, refusing to stay buried. What he carried was no longer just the pain of choosing between duty and desire, nor the ache of incompatibility that tore two lives apart. It was the crushing weight of betrayal, one that did not come from a single person, but from the world that fed on his most intimate moments. And as that grief sharpened into something colder, the truth of why his confession had been so heavy began to reveal itself. It happened in the most humiliating way possible. A private conversation, one that should have stayed between two people who believed they still had something safe to hold on to, was suddenly everywhere. It echoed through living rooms, splashed across newspapers, whispered in classrooms and workplaces, analyzed by strangers who felt entitled to every detail of his life. The leaked phone call became more than a scandal. It became a weapon, pointed at everything he had tried to protect. For Charles, hearing his own voice, played back by the media, was like reliving the same wound over and over. It wasn't just the content of the call that cut deep, but what it represented: a complete loss of control over his own narrative. There was no room for nuance, no space for understanding. The world heard one version, the wrong version, and decided he would be the villain. It painted his heart as reckless and cruel, ignoring the years of unspoken strain and silent suffering that led him there. And wrapped inside that humiliation was Camilla. Her presence, once a place of comfort, a reminder of familiarity in a life filled with expectation, became the face of the scandal. She was no longer just the woman he had loved long before the world cared. She was now the symbol of everything torn apart. Every headline, every cruel comment, every joke made at their expense deepened the damage. Her involvement turned the wound into something raw and unbearable, because suddenly the sorrow that had once belonged only to him became entangled with hers. And in that entanglement, something darker formed. He hated what she had come to represent in his life, not because he despised her character or wished her harm, but because her presence seemed to summon pain wherever it touched. Through her, he lost his privacy. Through her, he lost the little peace he had left. Through her, the fracture in his marriage widened until it became impossible to repair. Every time her name was mentioned, it carried echoes of shame, public ridicule, and a story he never wanted to live. This hatred was not the kind the world imagines when it hears the word. It was the kind born from heartbreak, a complicated, tangled emotion aimed at the chaos her presence created around him. Even when he tried to protect her, even when he remembered the warmth of their early bond, he could not escape the truth that her involvement had turned his life into a spectacle. The quiet, private companionship he once treasured had transformed into a storm that swept through everything he held dear. And when Diana, with the softness of a wounded heart, publicly admitted that there had been 3 people in her marriage, the world took her side without hesitation. Public sympathy tilted instantly, leaving him more isolated than ever. He had failed someone who deserved better, and yet he also felt betrayed by a system that had never allowed him to choose differently. Everything collided: shame, sorrow, regret, and the painful realization that in his world, love could be more destructive than comforting. This was the moment that pushed him closer to the confession that weighed on his chest. The moment when he understood that the hatred he spoke of was only the beginning of a deeper truth waiting to be unraveled. So how could love, sorrow, and regret converge to reveal a truth he never expected? What lies beneath his confession? A throne. Too heavy for a father's heart. What followed the storm of leaked secrets was not relief, but a new kind of pain, one that struck deeper than humiliation, deeper than scandal, deeper than the crushing weight of public judgment. It was the pain that came when he looked at his children and realized how much of their innocence had been sacrificed to the chaos that surrounded him. The sorrow he carried from Camilla's presence, once something he tried to shoulder quietly, now reached into the one place he had hoped would remain untouched: his family. The world often imagined royal children growing up in glittering halls, shielded from the troubles that affected ordinary families. But for Charles, William and Harry were never symbols. They were his sons. 2 young boys who needed stability, warmth, and a peaceful home. 2 boys whose memories would eventually be shaped not by soft childhood moments, but by the tension that thickened every room they entered. Everything he had tried to protect them from slowly seeped into their lives, despite his desperate attempts to hold the pieces together. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that becoming a father might heal some of the wounds that already existed in his marriage. There was a time he believed that the presence of children could act as a bridge, softening the sharp edges, easing the strain, reminding both him and Diana of the family they were meant to build together. But instead, the pressure of presenting a perfect royal family only deepened the cracks. Every family photo became a performance. Every outing became a test. Every smile had to be measured and placed correctly for the cameras. And beneath the false calm, resentment grew. Resentment fueled by the presence of another woman whose shadow lingered too close for comfort. Camilla, though not physically in the household, was spiritually present in every argument that erupted, in every misunderstanding, in every moment Diana felt unseen and unloved. Her name, even when unspoken, hovered over the family like a constant reminder of everything broken. And Charles, unable to erase the past, unable to change the expectations placed upon him, found himself suffocating under the guilt. He saw how deeply Diana loved their sons, how fiercely she protected them, and how dedicated she was to giving them what the crown could not: normal moments, genuine affection, and emotional warmth. Her devotion made his own failures more painful. It reminded him that the life he had to offer was always going to be tainted by a history he could never fully escape. In the quiet of the night, when the palace hallways were empty and the world outside slept, he wrestled with the bitter truth. Camilla's presence had not only disrupted his marriage, it had denied him the chance to give his children the kind of home he believed they deserved. He hated the complicated emotions that surfaced whenever he thought of her. He hated the way her history entangled itself with his present. And most of all, he hated the reality that the life he had chosen, or perhaps the life chosen for him, had forced his children into the middle of a story far too heavy for their young shoulders. This hatred was never simple. It was not directed solely at her as a person, but at what her involvement represented: the impossibility of building something whole in a world already fractured, the impossibility of having a peaceful family life when every choice, every connection, every mistake was magnified for the world to see. Yet even as this pain consumed him, he sensed there were still deeper layers to unravel, older wounds tied to a past long before his sons were born. And those memories, too, were calling him back, demanding to be faced. And now, as old wounds resurface and memories whisper, what secrets from the past will force the king to confront himself? Stay tuned. Shadows of a Haunting Past. Before Camilla became a duchess, and long before the grand ceremonies and royal appearances, there existed a tangled map of old lovers, broken promises, and memories that refused to fade. The king, once full of hope and anticipation for a life of genuine love, found himself confronting a past that clung relentlessly, casting shadows over every present joy. Camilla's early life unfolded in a world where charm and strategy intertwined. She married Andrew Parker Bowles on July 4, 1973, and their union produced 2 children: Tom, born December 18, 1974, and Laura in 1978. That marriage, though outwardly respectable, could not contain the restless tides of her personal desires, ultimately ending in divorce in 1995. These dates and names were not just historical markers. They were milestones of a history that refused to let go. Each a reminder of love lost, trust broken, and lives forever intertwined with her choices. For the king, the pain was not merely about jealousy or rivalry. It was a profound sorrow born of history's persistence. Every smile Camilla offered, every courtly gesture, echoed the memory of a past that refused to be buried. The bitterness he harbored was aimed squarely at that enduring presence, a life that seemed to mock his attempts at renewal. Where he longed for fresh beginnings, he instead found constant reminders that some chapters were never meant to be closed. He hated Camilla not merely for what she did in the present, but for how she made the world around him unbearably heavy. Her very existence, entwined with old flames and unresolved passions, turned joy into quiet torment. Every gathering, every family event, every fleeting public moment was tainted by the weight of history she carried with her. She became, in his eyes, a living testament to broken promises and the inevitability of sorrow. Her influence was subtle, yet unrelenting, coloring even the brightest corners of his life with grief and disillusionment. In moments of solitude, he poured his heart out, not just in complaint but in sorrowful reflection. The letters, the whispered confessions to trusted friends, the late-night confessions, all bore witness to a man grappling with the relentless presence of a past he could neither rewrite nor escape. He mourned what might have been, what should have been, and what, despite all efforts, never would be. This was not mere bitterness. It was heartbreak molded by circumstance, compounded by the knowledge that history does not bend to desire. Camilla's past, her choices, and the life she carried with her were inescapable. And through it all, the king was left navigating the delicate balance between duty, love, and the shadows of a haunting past that refused to relent. But what do you think lingers deeper? His heartbreak, her shadow, or the hidden past that shaped every public misstep? Stay with us. The weight of the crown and the confessions within. When a man becomes king, the intensity of his anger can easily be mistaken for duty, or in rarer moments, for confession. For Charles, that day arrived on September 8, 2022, when the death of Queen Elizabeth II ended an era and placed the crown squarely upon his head. With it came Camilla's ascent as queen consort, a reality decades in the making. Their engagement, announced long before, and their marriage in 2005, were now framed under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny, yet no public ceremony or accolade could soften the private wounds he carried. The king's bitterness had grown over the years, shaped not merely by public judgment, but by the weight of choices that never fully belonged to him. Camilla, in his view, was not just a woman he once loved and lost, or a companion who re-entered his life in complex, uneasy patterns. She was a symbol of a past that refused to fade, a persistent reminder of roads taken and those denied, a force that compelled him into compromises that chipped at his very soul. Each encounter with her presence, every acknowledgement of her role, forced him to confront the parts of himself he had tried and failed to protect. He poured his heart out in private, confessing to trusted friends and confidants the sorrow that accompanied every decision. His words were not accusations. They were revelations of exhaustion, heartbreak, and the relentless ache of living in a life pre-written by circumstance and expectation. In those confessions, he traced the path of his resentment back to moments that were never fully his. The unending cycles of public scrutiny, the judgments cast by history, and the relentless intrusion of a life intertwined with Camilla's, which made every world around him seem darker and more constrained. His hatred, he admitted quietly, was not arbitrary. It was a distilled reaction to a reality he had never asked for yet could not escape. Camilla represented more than past loves or missteps. She embodied the persistence of history, the impossibility of a life lived entirely on his own terms. Every gesture, every smile, every carefully measured word she offered carried the echoes of old entanglements. Where joy might have existed, he found unease. Where hope might have flourished, he saw restraint. Her presence, even in moments of ceremony or casual interaction, transformed his surroundings into reminders of what he had endured, what he had been forced to reconcile, and the compromises that defined his life more than his desires ever could. In this emotional crucible, the king confronted the final truth behind the bitterness that had shadowed him for decades. Camilla was simultaneously many things: a person, a past, and a role that demanded impossible navigation. She was the embodiment of all the forces that shaped his resentment, and in naming her, he laid bare the complexity of love, duty, and loss. In his heart, he admitted, without dramatization or flourish, the depth of his emotion. "I hated her." And within that simple phrase lay the weight of a lifetime: sorrow, heartbreak, and the relentless tension between what was chosen and what was endured. So, what do you think truly drove the king to confess his deepest pain and hatred? Was it love lost, duty betrayed, or history's relentless shadow? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.